Well, thank you, everybody, for tuning in today. My name is Dave Palmer, General Manager here at KATH 910 AM. This is the Interview of the Week, and we're going to talk about a topic today that we have not covered yet on this program, a very unique topic, and it's a local gentleman by the name of Silvio Canto Jr., who has written a book called Cubanos in Wisconsin. And Silvio is a member, along with his wife Beatrice, and he has 3 sons, but he and his wife are members of St. Catherine of Siena Parish in Carrollton, where I first met him a couple of years ago. And he's also a small businessman and a radio host, and so he does quite a bit. And he's also a Knight of Columbus as well. So we welcome him to the program, talking about the book he has recently written called Cubanos in Wisconsin. There is a website, cubanosinwisconsin.com, where you can order the book if you are so inclined. Silvio, thank you for joining us today.
My pleasure. Thank you so much for the invitation. It's great.
Yeah, I've heard so much about, of course, we hear so much in the news about Fidel Castro, especially now at the twilight of his life, and the people fleeing Cuba. But I've never actually talked to anybody who fled Cuba. You're my first one.
Okay, well,
much less somebody who fled Cuba and ended up in Wisconsin.
Well, the first part is likely. The second part very unlikely.
Yeah, let me. This is a fascinating story, and I know there's a real big faith element in this as well. But if we could just. I want to kind of go back to the beginning. If I may ask, when were you born, just so I can put this in some...
yeah, sure, 1952.
Okay, so you're born in 52, and in what year did Fidel, I'm sure it was a progressive thing, but when did he officially kind of take over the island?
Well, the change took place on the 1st of January, 1959.
Okay.
It sort of happened, Batista, who was running the country, fled the country that night. So December 31st, 58, as the year changes, Cuba changes very dramatically as well. So 1959 was the very first year, and that means he's been there over 50 years now.
Yeah, and so you weren't a toddler. I mean, you're a good 6, 7 years old.
I was six the night that it happened. As I write in the book, I slept through the revolution. It's kind of funny, I went back and reconstructed some of this with my parents so that I would be relating the correct story. But the first day of January 1959, I wake up like most kids do in the morning, and my brother and I, who's a year younger, we wake up and we go to the dining room to eat breakfast like kids do. And my mom, I noticed my dad's on the phone. There's a lot of stuff going on TV and all that kind of stuff. So my mom just kind of motions us to sit down and eat breakfast, and then my mom says, Batista left the night before. And, that obviously didn't mean anything to me. Castro didn't officially take over that night. He actually didn't happen for several weeks. But nevertheless, that was the night that it all started. And that was, that was just an amazing morning. And people of my generation, I've spoken to other Cubans like me who will tell you the same thing. They were sleeping that night.
Yeah.
A lot of Cubans were out that night, actually. A lot of our parents. Wasn't the case with my parents. I don't know why they didn't go out, because they usually did. But a lot of parents... actually found out about it while they were out dancing and waiting for the new year. So
this wasn't something that it wasn't a bloody revolution, or there wasn't a war going on. Was it just one guy fled and the other guy took over, or how did the transition happen?
It was kind of like that a little bit. Obviously, there was a great deal of disenchantment with Batista for a lot of different reasons. But the Cuban economy was actually doing quite well. But I think there was a sense that the politics was a bit corrupt, and in 1958, when the United States President Eisenhower cut off the military assistance to Batista, I think that was a signal that even the United States wanted to see a change. One guy fled. Officially, somebody else actually took over. Castro himself did not have an official position until later when he was made prime minister. But he was obviously, at the moment, he was the popular figure that I think had the following. Everybody kind of knew that he would probably take over.
Yeah. And did everybody know at the time that this was a communist regime?
Oh, no, not at all. Not at all. That's one of the great deceptions, really, of the Cuban story, because there was really no nothing at all was ever advertised that this was a communist revolution. On the contrary, it was advertised as very much of a democratic movement where people just wanted to see a change in Cuba, but there was never any real. Nobody ever said anything about communism. In fact, it was denied. Castro denied that he was a communist because when it first happened, and he came up here in April of 1959, came up to the United States. He was actually interviewed on Meet the Press. You can go to YouTube and see the video, very interesting video,
Yeah.
looking back at it now. He spoke at the National Press Club, and everywhere he went, he was asked that question because some people were skeptical whether he was really a revolutionary or a communist, and he said over and over and over again that he was not a communist, that he wanted to have democratic change, and of course that didn't turn out that way.
Yeah. And so take us over the next year or two. Obviously, your family fled, and so things went south.
Right.
Well, what was the progressive change that became alarming for your family and so many
Right.
others?
Well, we fled in '64, so we lived through 5 years of it. But in 1959, there's a great deal of hope at the beginning. People are talking about elections, but by the summer of '59 into the fall of '59, my parents begin to get disenchanted because there are no elections, and on the contrary, you begin to see the government just growing and growing into a lot of things. A lot of good people were executed, people who had no reason to be executed. A lot of people began to be thrown in jail. I mean, you begin to see the signs of a repressive state in the summer of '59. Castro starts going after the church, for example. He starts going after newspapers, and he's showing every signal that this is not what we thought it was. In September '59, I don't want to get too much into the weeds of Cuban history, but in September '59, a very important member of the Cuban government disappears in a plane in a very rare, unusual disappearance. Mm-hmm. Some other of his commanding forces, or a couple of his commanders, are arrested. And you begin to see, in retrospect now, we kind of know what's happening. In retrospect, Castro is consolidating power with him and his brother and Che Guevara, who eventually was also lost or was killed later. So I think you're beginning to see in '59 the signs that this is not really going to be a democratic transition. And my parents become very, very disenchanted by the end of '59. Now, they're still hoping for a resolution. They weren't really thinking about leaving the country at the time. They thought, well, maybe there'll be a resolution to this, and, there'll be a reform, and we'll get over this. But it actually got worse and worse and worse. Some of the listeners, some of the older listeners, I hate to put it that way, but some of the people may remember who may remember the 1960 election. They may remember that Kennedy and Nixon, Cuba became a very important topic in the Kennedy-Nixon election.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And the debates, in fact, and John Kennedy, who at the time was running to the right of Nixon on foreign policy, beat up the Kennedy administration. The Eisenhower administration for, in essence, allowing Cuba, because by that time, I think the perception was that Castro was going communist. I mean, he was certainly sending out signals. He invited the Soviets to take a trip to Cuba. He went to the UN. He gave a speech against the United States. I mean, he was very much anti-American at the time, and to the surprise of those who followed him, because those were never his words before he came to power. Mm. Then Kennedy wins the election, and there's a great deal of anticipation in Cuba that something is going to happen because Kennedy had said so much during the debates. Then into 1961, Cuba is really, really hopping with anti-Castro movements. There are people in the mountains who are now fighting him, basically turning the tables on him. And then comes the Bay of Pigs. And the Bay of Pigs happens in April 1961, and I relate in the book how it impacted us. The Bay of Pigs obviously fails for reasons that that could be a whole show on itself.
Yeah.
After the Bay of Pigs, there's a great deal of repression against Cubans like my parents, who had shown at least displeasure with the system. Castro then really goes radical after that. He closes the Catholic church that I was attending. He really goes after the newspapers, and I think he declares sometime in '61 that he is and has always been a Marxist-Leninist. So that there, I think he puts the cards on the table. Then comes the missile crisis in '62. There was still hope at that time. My parents thought that maybe something could be done. But after the missile crisis, it became very clear that it was going to be very difficult to make anything change in Cuba. So my parents decided to leave around '63. And we finally had the opportunity to leave in July of '64. So that's a very quick but history of Cuba. And here I am. I'm a kid in the middle of all of this, like any other kid of that age. I'm thinking about baseball and having fun with my brother. But we're in the middle of this incredible stuff that is happening all around us.
Let me ask you, by the time y'all were getting ready you had decided to go in '63, I think you had said you had shut down the schools. So what about the active practice of your faith? Were you still allowed to go to worship in church, or was that shut down also?
No, the churches were kept open. But all of the Catholic schools, which was the majority, the overwhelming majority of the religious schools were Catholic, obviously. There were some other Protestant schools and Jewish schools, but the majority of the schools were Catholic. They were all shut down. All of the priests, foreign priests, and there was a very significant number of foreign priests in Cuba from Spain and France and other Latin countries, all of them were thrown out of the country, the nuns as well. And so they were all thrown out. So there was still Mass going on, but the kids were obviously discouraged to attend Mass. One of the things that communist governments do is they understand they're not going to be able to change a 45 or 50-year-old person. They're too far into their faith to change. But what they do is they go after the young kids, and they begin doing that at schools by indoctrinating them and, in essence, turning them against their parents. And what I find interesting about this story that I'm relating now is that I have spoken to people from some of the Soviet countries, Romania, the former Soviet republics and the Eastern Bloc countries, and I talk to them, and the stories are so similar. That's exactly what the Soviets did in Russia. That's exactly what the Soviets did, or the communists did in Romania and these other countries. They would go after the church because they were really afraid of the church. They saw the church as the one enemy they couldn't compete with, if you know what I mean.
Sounds familiar. So Silvio Canto Jr. is my guest. He has written a fascinating book, Cubanos in Wisconsin. The website is cubanosinwisconsin.com, about his family's flight from Cuba in the mid-'60s after the revolution in '59, which he has been talking about, and they landed in Wisconsin of all places. And I guess I want to hear more about coming to America and all that, but I want to just ask you the question that I kind of hinted at a moment ago: is having lived through this, what parallels do you see in our current situation in this country? Perhaps not so drastic, but do you see some things that frighten you?
Well, I think that the one thing, the lesson that I learned in Cuba as a very young boy, but I've never forgotten it, is that things fall apart very quickly. That communism and the takeover can happen very, very quickly. And I think you have to be very careful not to surrender any of your freedoms, because once you do, it's like dominoes. They fall very fast. So that's number one. You have to be very, very protective of your freedoms. And obviously, now that I'm an American, have grown up here and love this country as any adopted child would love his adopted parents, I just, I'm very protective of our freedoms, the freedom of religion. That's why I'm very concerned, for example, about these Obamacare mandates on our faith, on what we believe as Catholics. Even gun control. People don't understand how important that is. And one of the first things that dictators do, somebody said to me one time, the first two things that dictators do is they shut down newspapers and they take away your guns. Well, that's the First and the Second Amendments right there.
Yeah,
so
right.
Our founding fathers had to know something when they put them in there. So I think that even though, they are different, Cuba and the United States, but I always tell my American friends when I talk to them, I said, just be very careful about surrendering your freedoms, because when it happens real fast. If you had said to my parents in 1959 that what would happen in Cuba would happen in the next 2 or 3 years, they would have never believed you. They would have said, no way that can happen here. Well, it did.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, but people have to be conditioned to a certain degree to not rise up against something like that. I mean, were the people of Cuba, why was there not I guess there was a counter-revolution, but nothing that ever was effective. Seems like, at least in my limited view of history, most people just fled rather than fighting against the communist government. Was that just impossible?
Well, it was very hard, I'll put it that way. Obviously, leaving was a better option, especially if you had children. But there was actually a very, very active anti-Castro movement in the Escambray Mountains, which is in the middle of the country, and thousands of guerrillas fought Castro. What happened, though, is after the missile crisis, it became very difficult to bring any weapons into Cuba, and basically these people in the mountains were left with. I mean, they were literally fighting with machetes and pistols against an army of MiGs and Soviet tanks. And one of the things that Castro did is that he used overwhelming force against these people. He literally killed them. Mm-hmm. I mean, he basically said, if you want to, if you don't like my approach, I'm going to kill you or throw you in jail. So that kind of repression is often very difficult to deal with. And so what's happened in Cuba over the years, there hasn't been a rebellion of the type that people would think about. But there's a story that, when I talk to people in Cuba who've grown up there, they always tell me that the people of Cuba have two faces. They have the face that they show the world when they leave their home, which is a sort of a pro-Castro face, and then the face that they have at home, which is an anti-Castro face. And this is why they fear religion so much, because in the church, people can talk freely and people can pray to something that they cannot control. That's why they hate religion, and it drives them crazy when religion, when people get religious. And frankly, during the 70s and the 80s, even Christmas was not celebrated in Cuba. They were so afraid of religion, they shut down Easter, they shut down Christmas. I mean, they were just literally scared of it.
Interesting. And so you think the average person in Cuba right now is sounds like they're living somewhat of a double life. Do you think there's a lot of discontent and unhappiness in the country?
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. There has always been. Let me just back up for a second. There's always opportunists, okay, in any system. And there are people who become a part of the system because, I'll give you an example. My dad could have done that. My dad was a banker, and my dad could have at some point said, okay, look, I'm just going to join this thing. And, my dad would have been able to have a fairly prominent position in the bank because a lot of people had left the bank, and Castro needed bankers who understood banking. So my dad could have gotten a job with, the National Bank and gotten a certain amount of bureaucratic benefits, and maybe we would have had a car, or maybe we would have had some other benefits. So a lot of people did that. It's the old story: if you can't beat them, join them. So There's a lot of opportunists, a lot of people who do that in any communist government. If you talk to anybody who lived in the Soviet Union, they'll tell you the same thing. But deep inside, they know there's something wrong. And the best test of this is that they've never had elections.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And if you don't hold elections, if you're telling me on one hand that everybody supports you and that everybody loves what you're doing and you're the most popular guy in town, but you won't hold elections, what that tells me that you're not as popular as you think.
Yeah, right. What do you? Gosh, I could talk forever with you.
Sure.
This is really fascinating, and we're only scratching the surface. Silvio Canto Jr., by the way, is my guest. He has written Gabriel Canto. Is that your son?
That's our son.
Okay.
Yeah, my son Gabriel. I got to tell you a little story that fathers will understand. He's a first-year student at SMU Law School. Very bright young man. He's our second son, and I showed him the draft, my original draft of the book. I showed it to my sons because I wanted them to see what Dad did,
Yeah.
So my son looked at me and he said, "Dad, this is real good, but this is really boring." I think fathers will understand that.
So he rewrote it, or what?
Well, he didn't rewrite it completely, but he basically suggested a lot of style changes. He said, "Look, maybe you ought to set it up this way," and a lot of the style and the presentation, he had a lot to do with it. So that's why, I put him on the book as well. He, as I said, I couldn't have. I would have written the book, but it wouldn't have been as good as the one that was published. He did a great job in in helping me. He likes writing, which is helpful.
Yeah, I know. Are you finding an audience for this? Or is it mostly Cuban Americans, or who's buying the book?
Well, it's only a couple of weeks, so we're still getting it off the ground. I find it very interesting. Maybe the best way to answer your question is to look at the reviews.
Yeah.
My very first review, as expected, came from a Cuban American blog, the Babalu blog, which is very popular with Cuban Americans. My second review came from a fellow named Captain Capitalism, who looked at this thing strictly from the economics, saying, communism is a bad thing. My third review came from a group up in Wisconsin that reviews books about Wisconsin, and they saw the title, they got fascinated, and they wrote it. I just had another review by a fellow named the Prairie Editor up in Minnesota, and I know there's a couple of others coming. American Thinker, who's a conservative website, also wrote about it. And I think what they're all saying is that this is a book about family and freedom that just happens to have been about a Cuban family. It could have been written about a Jewish family, for example, leaving Nazi Germany. It could have been written about another family leaving the Soviet Union. So I think I'm attracting, as I talk to people, I'm attracting an audience of people who believe in freedom.
Yeah.
And that's a good thing, because that's what I tell people when I talk about the book.
Yeah. Interesting. Let me ask you one more question, because we are past time, but what do you see in the future of Cuba now that I guess Castro's passing along the helm to his was his brother, isn't it? Or
no, his brother, his younger brother. Well, he's in very bad health, Castro. He hasn't really been seen. I mean, he has not really had an active role. I think he's made a couple of cameo appearances, but he's in bad health, and he's pretty much, he cannot really work, as they say, at running the country. His younger brother is not a popular figure at all. He never was. But his younger brother, I think, is beginning to realize that the system does not work.
Yeah.
That socialism doesn't really work, and he's hoping to strike some deals. But the way I look at it, I'm actually optimistic about Cuba in 25 or 30 years. I think Cuba will bounce back from this horrible experience and will do quite well. I think if you and I were doing this interview 30 years from now, I think I would tell you that I think Cuba is doing quite well, that it'll have a relationship with the United States again, it'll have a good civilian government, and things will actually be good for the country. My biggest concern is really the next 5 years, because I don't know what kind of transition Cuba is going to have. I mean, there's a couple of historic examples. You have the situation in Romania where the dictator was literally overthrown and killed. And then you have the transition, for example, in Spain, where Franco really worked at setting up a transition. I don't think he's gotten enough credit for that, but he did a good job in setting up a transition to a democratic government. So there's a couple of scenarios. Obviously, one's very bloody, the other one's not. Well, I'm just hoping that when that moment comes, and it's a lot closer than people realize, because the economics of Cuba are just so bad. The Cuban government can no longer get credit from the Soviet Union. There's no subsidy from the Soviet Union. So, I mean, they literally have to live in the real world, and they're just totally unprepared for that. So I'm actually optimistic in the long run, but in the short run, I hope that there's someone who can be a provisional president who can actually navigate the ship through some very choppy waters. Yeah,
very interesting. Well, I do recommend everybody pick up a copy of this book. Silvio Canto Jr. and his son Gabriel Canto wrote Cubanos in Wisconsin. And the website to order it is cubanosinwisconsin.com. I guess that's where you recommend people get it, but can they also get...
Yeah, they can go there. That's the Amazon. That we offer some of the buyers an opportunity for a signed copy. So if you want a signed copy, there's an option for that, and I'll dedicate it to you. And I will tell you one quick plug about the book. If you have a Cuban dad or a Cuban mom or a Cuban grandfather or a Cuban mom, this would be a great book to dedicate to them. For Father's Day or Mother's Day coming up later, and because I think that one of my objectives was to create communication between the older generation and the new generation, because I really want people to talk about Cuba. One of the realities, and I'll say one last thing, is one of the realities, the older generation, my parents who came here, obviously they're getting older, and now we're in a situation where we have, the Cubans are having kids, but the Cubans were born here, having kids born here. So I hope that connection between my parents' generation, the real heroes, if you will, of our story, and the new people, I hope we keep that connected so that everybody understands why we came here and for what reasons, and our parents were wonderful people, and it's important to continue that everybody should know that.
All right. Silvio, thank you very much. Again, the website again, cubanosinwisconsin.com, or you can get it on other online book portals. And I do appreciate very much you spending some time with us today. Very interesting story.
My pleasure. Anytime.
Thank you. And everybody, thanks for listening. We'll see you next week for the next interview of the week here on KATH 910 AM on the Guadalupe Radio Network.